Remember to sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday, you'll receive an email from the Washington Times giving you a look inside the stories we talk about on the podcast. The history, politics, culture in all its complexity. Sign up at historyasithappens.com. History as It Happens, February 16th, 2023. The 1619 Hustle.
I'm not a historian, but I study history and I study the field, and I know that it is very common for historians to disagree with each other.
The New York Times 1619 Project is now a Hulu docuseries, beautifully produced and brilliantly marketed. But it's still a historical botch job. Its creators and cheerleaders can't seem to get the American Revolution right. But maybe that's the point. Calling Lord Dunmore again. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So this goes back to the original issue in 2019 of the 1619 Project. Nicole Hannah-Jones makes this sweeping claim that slavery is one of the major motivations for the American Revolution. She says that the colonists essentially revolted over slavery because they thought the British Empire was a threat to the institution. Now, that was a very generic claim. They later tailored it down, and I think they added a line that said some of the colonists, but still it was a fairly imprecise version. And as the project has developed, they've kind of backfilled in the narrative, backfilled in the story. And the main piece of evidence that they now claim is that in November 1775, Lord Dunmore, who's the last royalist governor of Virginia, issues a decree basically asking for the slaves of rebellious plantation owners to join his militia and help him militarily retake the colony.
No publication in recent memory has provoked more debate and political hand-wringing than the New York Times 1619 Project. As you know from listening to the podcast, I've spoken to historians on all sides of the issue, mostly focusing on what the project says about the American Revolution, the importance of slavery to the U.S. economy, slavery's overall importance in the antebellum period. So I was not planning on revisiting this until the 1619 Project's docuseries premiered on Hulu, and once again, it distorts the past. Why, one wonders, why after all this time does Nicole Hannah-Jones still insist that some colonists broke with the crown to defend slavery? Is it really about disagreements over Dunmore's proclamation in 1775, a relatively minor event that most people outside of professional historians had never heard of? Well, I can't say why for sure, but Hannah-Jones does say she's making a case for reparations. So I guess the American Revolution then has to be seen at least in part as a pro-slavery revolution so it can fit the narrative about unrelenting white supremacy. Now, distinguished historians have pointed out, of course, that the fate of slavery was not an issue that divided colonists from Parliament, among other egregious mistakes and distortions. This is how Nicole Hannah-Jones responded to academic criticism in an interview with C-SPAN in late 2021 to promote her 1619 Project book.
Yeah, so I wasn't surprised that academic historians pushed back. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I study history and I study the field, and I know that it is very common for historians to disagree with each other and to disagree with each other publicly and to say, that's not my interpretation, or I think you argued that, maybe you gave too much emphasis on this and I wouldn't have. That is normal. But what did surprise me was that there wasn't just an effort to say, we don't agree with this. But there was really an effort to discredit the project, to argue in an open letter that this project was wrong and dangerous and children shouldn't be taught it. And that was very surprising to me.
Attacks on her work have come from all over the political spectrum, manifesting in some bizarre, nearly paranoid ways, as when Senator Marsha Blackburn asked Ketanji Brown Jackson about it during the latter's Supreme Court confirmation hearing.
You have praised the 1619 Project, which argues the U.S. is a fundamentally racist country, and you have made clear that you believe judges must consider critical race theory when deciding how to sentence criminal defendants. Is it your personal hidden agenda to incorporate critical race theory into our legal system?
So maybe we'll stick to what historians are saying rather than politicians. About the Hulu docuseries, the opening episode is titled Democracy. And the segment on the Revolutionary War and slavery is set in Williamsburg, Virginia, outside the old governor's palace. Several months after fleeing that palace because of the revolt against Crown authority, in November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the last royal governor of Virginia, issued his proclamation offering freedom to the slaves of rebels who fled to British lines and agreed to take up arms for King George III. Now, as mentioned, the rebellion was underway by this point in Virginia, although there hadn't been any major battles in Virginia yet. The Declaration of Independence wouldn't be signed for another 8 months, but the American colonies became effectively independent in 1774. And months before Dunmore's proclamation, the king had already declared the colonists in open rebellion. So it may be absurd to suggest, as Nicole Hannah-Jones and historian Woody Holton do in the first episode of the Hulu docuseries, that Dunmore's proclamation was an important cause of the war. Well, here's what they say in that episode. They say the proclamation turned colonists who hadn't made up their minds toward independence, turned these fence-sitters and Tories toward the revolution. So that is a more measured claim. Holton may be the 1619 Project's biggest cheerleader among professional historians. And he said in that episode, some of them, meaning white Southerners, said there's no other expedient you could have thought of that was as likely as this to turn us against you. Well, that sounds like pretty convincing evidence, right? Except Holton botches that quote badly. It wasn't some, it was one. South Carolina's Edward Rutledge, who heard news of Dunmore's proclamation while he was at the Continental Congress in Pennsylvania. Not to go down this rabbit hole again, but it is important to demonstrate how dishonest Hannah-Jones and Holton are. As Sean Wilentz wrote in an article a couple of years ago for The Atlantic about the misuse of the Rutledge quote by a New York Times editor and others, in a private letter explaining his evolving thoughts, Rutledge described the proclamation as tending, in my judgment, more effectively to work an eternal separation between Britain and America than any other expedient which could possibly have been thought of. Wilentz goes on to write that Rutledge's personal and speculative observation is turned into conclusive proof, but it is not evidence of what the proclamation actually did, rather just one man's expectation as to what it would do. And as we know, there were no major slave revolts in Virginia. Now, Holton has also publicly shared more than 70 documents he says offer evidence that some colonists revolted because of Dunmore. As he put it on Twitter, that colonial whites' rage at the Anglo-African alliance pushed them toward independence. But his collection of cherry-picked quotes and speculative observations at the time only prove what we already knew. A lot of people were angry at Dunmore's proclamation, but there is scant evidence that any patriot was converted to the cause because of it. On the contrary, Lord Dunmore himself reported his proclamation received an immediate positive reception. 100 former rebels signed loyalty pledges the day after, and he estimated about 3,000 Virginians pledged to support the royal government. Now, about a year ago, Holton debated the great Gordon Wood about this stuff for the Massachusetts Historical Society. That debate is available on YouTube if you're interested in checking it out. In parts of the hour-long exchange, Holton constantly interrupts and talks over Wood, even accusing him of inciting the right-wing backlash against the 1619 Project because Wood co-authored an open letter criticizing the project's many errors.
We used to call it in the 18th century outlawry. Where you put an outlawry on somebody, anyone can kill them. Now,
going back to
she has gotten death threats. I don't mean you literally killed her, but you killed the 1619 Project in a way that opened it up to censorship. And so you are a founding father, Professor Wood, of a massive campaign of censorship. You're not the most responsible, but the 5 of you are responsible. And that's why right now I want to ask you to write another open letter.
Nicole Hannah-Jones may not know what she's talking about, but one wonders why a professional historian would embarrass himself the way Holton has. The 1619 Project isn't really about history anyway. It's about politics and excellent marketing for the New York Times. I mean, it has been a smash hit. The Hulu episode mentions the critics, referring to them as conservatives, with clips of people like Newt Gingrich, not the distinguished scholars who have made principled criticisms. It's just conservatives who have a political axe to grind. Debating this or that point about Dunmore, in a way, misses the point. The 1619 Project didn't unearth any part of our past that historians haven't already been talking about for decades. There's really not much new here, and strangely, I didn't learn any new insights about the nature of American democracy or black people's important role in it by watching the show on Hulu. It's really light on substance. But anyway, about the Dunmore debate, it's a prop to make an argument about the nature of our country, our founding. But it is a distortion. It is sophistry, beautifully produced sophistry, just as wrong as ongoing attempts by right-wingers to impose patriotic versions of history on school districts. Just check out the Hillsdale College 1776 curriculum for an example of this kind of garbage. One of the 1619 Project's more vocal critics these days is historian Phil Magness at the American Institute for Economic Research. It is a conservative, free market think tank. Phil Magness, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Why did you decide to jump into this mess again? On Twitter, I've been following your Twitter account. You've posted detailed critiques of the Hulu docuseries about Dunmore and other issues. You've been debating defenders of the 1619 Project, which isn't always a pleasant experience.
Well, part of it comes from just my own academic background and work. I'm an economic historian by background and training, and the main area that comprises, I'd say, the bulk of my academic research is in the economics of slavery and how that played out in the 19th century United States. I've been writing on this basically since graduate school. Have several books published on it, probably over a dozen academic articles on the Civil War era and slavery and related themes. And in fact, I had previously written for the New York Times on this subject when they had their older Disunion series, which marked the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. So when I first saw the 1619 Project come out in August 2019, I was initially excited, thinking that, hey, the New York Times is going to continue its foray into historical investigations of slavery. But as I'm reading it, I found that it was a very different character than previous iterations at the paper, which had used a multitude of perspectives, had tried to contextualize recent and new academic research and its popularization of these concepts. Rather, what the 1619 Project was doing was taking a very particular ideological political line and was only drawing on scholarship insofar as it seemed to support that line. And as a result of it, it also got many of the major claims and facts wrong right off the bat. So I entered into that debate, and it's basically been playing out consistently for the last 3 years now.
It was published in 19, so I guess this would be year 4. I was also excited about it at first, and I thought some of the initial essays were fine. But the claims about the American Revolution and the Civil War were really sloppy and maybe more than sloppy. Ideologically driven. And, this is a question of, is this history or is it about history? Are we really having a debate about history? I would say no. I think this is about ideology and a certain perspective, pro-reparations, and that's fine. I'm not against, in principle, the idea of reparations, however controversial it is politically. But that's not history. That is history in the service of an ideology, and also this is excellent marketing.
I think the ideological question that has played out in the 1619 Project from the beginning has been the driving motive here. I view it as a sense of taking historical events, some of which have kernels of truth behind them, some of which are actually necessary reinvestigations of the past. But that's not the object here. The object is to take those events and try to interpret politics in the 2020s in a very specific progressive ideological direction. But interestingly enough, this is something that's been noticed and picked up upon by historians and other scholars across the entire spectrum. Critiquing the 1619 Project is probably the first time in my entire career I found myself on the same side as the World Socialist website. I come at it from a free market kind of classical liberal perspective. They come from the very opposite end of the political spectrum, but we were noticing the same errors, and we were noticing that these errors were serving a political ideology, not a reinterpretation of the past as it was packaged.
That's right. The World Socialist website did a series of articles that are really tremendous in a point-by-point refutation of some of the 1619 Project. So this isn't new, this controversy, but there is something new to discuss here, I suppose. The Hulu docuseries about the 1619 Project. As I mentioned, I've been following your tweets about it. I began watching it, and I watched the Democracy episode about Dunmore. And now that episode is about a lot of stuff, not just the Dunmore Proclamation in 1775. But amazingly, or maybe not amazingly, they continue to botch it badly. So what are they still getting wrong about the importance of Dunmore's proclamation in November 1775, in your view?
Yeah. So this goes back to the original issue in 2019 of the 1619 Project. Nicole Hannah-Jones makes this sweeping claim that slavery is one of the major motivations for the American Revolution. She says that the colonists essentially revolted over slavery because they thought the British Empire was a threat to the institution. Now, that was a very generic claim. They later tailored it down, and I think they added a line that said some of the colonists, but still it was a fairly imprecise version. And as the project has developed, they've kind of backfilled in the narrative, backfilled in the story. And the main piece of evidence that they now claim is that in November 1775, Lord Dunmore, who's the last royalist governor of Virginia, issues a decree basically asking for the slaves of rebellious plantation owners to join his militia and help him militarily retake the colony. And in exchange for this service in his militia, he offers them freedom. So this event is well documented. It resulted in a couple hundred slaves making their way to Dunmore's militia. They actually do enlist, and several of them gain their freedom. They enter into a couple of small battles and skirmishes in late 1775. It's a part of the Revolutionary War history. But the problem here is that the timeline simply does not add up in the way that Nicole Hannah-Jones has presented it. She's making the claim that whether it's all of or some of the colonists that react very negatively to this proclamation by Lord Dunmore, she's making the claim that this is what pushes them over the edge into the quest for independence. And she claims this extends across basically all of the southern colonies and brings them into the revolutionary cause. The timeline doesn't add up, though, because the revolution was already well underway, including in the South. We all know Lexington and Concord, the famous battle, the shot heard around the world that starts in Massachusetts. That's in April of 1775. George Washington has fielded an army up in New England by June. By the midsummer, the colony of Virginia itself has mobilized the capital. Colonist militias have descended on the capital. Lord Dunmore himself, this figure that's supposedly the instigator, has been chased out of Williamsburg and is living on board a ship off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, a British Navy ship. So he's already been chased out of the colony. So the entire premise here of arguing that this is what starts the colonists' move towards independence in Virginia inverts the timeline by about 5 or 6 months from what actually happened.
And there's no question that Dunmore's proclamation, which had a lot of stuff in it, not just the offer to slaves to be emancipated should they reach British lines and join the British war effort. He also declared martial law. The colonists in Virginia were angry with him about a lot of stuff. I mean, he disbanded the House of Burgesses. I mean, there were a lot of things going on, a highly concentrated period. And part of the problem, I think, with attacking this issue in such finite detail and point-counterpoint about what Dunmore did or didn't do is we can lose sight of this larger picture, right, of a revolution,
Absolutely.
a rebellion that was already underway.
Well, and basically what you see with Lord Dunmore, he is not a popular guy. Long before this proclamation is issued, he has clashed with the colonists. The first major conflict that they have, he's a relatively new arrival to Virginia, is not all that popular after he arrives. Previous colonial governors had the support of the local population, even as some of the protests that are taking place in the 1760s against punitive measures that are coming out of Parliament from across the seas, the British governors are still effectively well regarded in Virginia and in Williamsburg until Dunmore. And what happens is over the summer of 1774, this is after some of the tax protests, the Boston Tea Party, everything takes place up in Boston, draws retaliatory measures from the Crown, basically shuttering the port of Boston. And the House of Burgesses, which is the elected body of the colony, declares a day of fasting and prayer, essentially in solidarity with the citizens of Boston that were being suppressed by the Crown. It's made in a very public forum. It's not overly poking the crown in the eye, but it's certainly signaling that Virginia and the other colonies are standing side by side with a truly unjust measure against Boston. And Lord Dunmore reacts to this by disbanding the legislature, basically saying that he's going to rule as an autocrat. Now, he does eventually bring them back over the next year, but it's a continuous series of conflicts he has with them. The main one occurs almost simultaneously to the battles of Lexington and Concord, although they don't realize that yet. The word hasn't reached Williamsburg.
So the day after the battle, right? The gunpowder.
Exactly. This is April 20th, 1775. Lord Dunmore, in the cover of night, sneaks into the gunpowder magazine in downtown Williamsburg, which had been erected by the colony at colony expenses, and he removes about 20 barrels of gunpowder and has them hauled away and put on board a British warship.
I think it's the James River.
Obviously, they find out that the gunpowder is being taken away, and they're furious. They're asking the governor, "Why are you stealing our powder?" And his response, which I've tracked down, he makes his first response in the newspaper the very next day, and he says, "Oh, well, I heard rumors that there's a slave revolt in a neighboring county, and I was taking the powder to keep it safe in case the slaves enter the magazine." And he expands this into an increasingly elaborate story. So about a week later, he issues a public statement where he alleges that he saw a group of slaves standing around the magazine doing menacing things at night. And as a result of this, he was moved to act to save the powder, to keep it safe for the colonists on their behalf. But Dunmore's a very duplicitous player, because at the same time he's making this public statement, he is issuing a private letter back to the crown, to one of the colonial agents. He sends a private letter and he says, "Yes, I took the powder out because I'm afraid the colonists are about to revolt and do the same thing that they did up in Massachusetts." So by this point, word of Lexington and Concord has reached Williamsburg, and he's claiming that there's a revolution underway. So that's why he really stole the powder. But at the same time, he's telling the residents of Williamsburg he's doing it to save them, to keep them safe from a slave revolt that really wasn't existent. It never materialized.
So he had been talking about emancipation, offering freedom to slaves, right? What he eventually did in November of 1775, he had been talking about that. In April, he may have even threatened it. He didn't follow through on it.
Right.
But it's not until he loses the colony and he's basically desperate that he goes ahead with this. But, historians have known about this for a long time. We've known for a long time that planters, slaveholders were worried all the time, really, different levels of intensity about slave revolts, and they were not happy about Dunmore's proclamation. They didn't want to lose their property. That's different than saying they broke with the crown, took up arms, declared independence formally the following year to protect the institution of slavery, which, of course, was not under attack by the king or parliament. It was an integral part of their mercantilist Atlantic economic system.
Oh, that's exactly the case. The Hulu series itself really portrays Lord Dunmore in a deceiving way through the omission about him. They never really tell the biography of this guy. And one of the most stunning things you find out about him, if you just dig into a little bit of the history, Lord Dunmore himself is not an opponent of slavery by any means. He owns a massive slave plantation about 6 miles up the river outside of Williamsburg, a plantation called Portobello. And as he flees the capital, which occurs in June 1775, after this gunpowder incident, after he's had this conflict with the colonists, he basically up and leaves knowing that the tide is turning against him. He takes all of the slaves out of the governor's palace with him and relocates them to his plantation. And we have these records of Dunmore, while he's living on board this ship, he orders his officers to row him over to his plantation house so he can have a fancy dinner served to him by all of his slaves. You see that also in the decree that he issues in November. He specifically exempts loyalist slave owners. If a slave of a loyalist makes their way to the British lines, they are sent back to slavery. And Dunmore is viewing this in a very intentional method because he wants to return to his own plantation.
That's right.
He wants to stake his place as a slave owner in the New World, in addition to being this colonial administrator.
A great article in the Journal of the American Revolution by Patrick Hannum. There's a footnote in that article that says Dunmore reported his proclamation received an immediate and positive reception when over 100 former rebels signed loyalty pledges the day after he issued the document. He estimated over 3,000 Virginians pledged to support the royal government. So, in fairness, Nikole Hannah-Jones and Woody Holton, who appear in this Hulu episode, they make a more measured claim. It sounds something like this. Anger over Dunmore's proclamation pushed fence-sitters further along the road to independence. I'll read a couple of passages briefly here. This is my transcript from the documentary. Hannah-Jones asks Holton, this turns, meaning Dunmore's proclamation, turns the fence-sitters, people who weren't sure if they wanted to join the movement for independence. I'm not sure how many of those Tories or fence-sitters are actually still left in Virginia. That's another point. Turns them towards the revolution, right? And Holton says, if you ask them, it did. The record, he says, is absolutely clear. I can't think of a point that I could make of the American Revolution where I can compile as many quotes as I can from white Southerners saying how furious they are at Governor Dunmore. Some of them said, there's no other expedient you could have thought of that was as likely as this to turn us against you. Well, that last part there about turning us against you, he botches a quote, not from some of them, from one of them, a South Carolinian.
Well, yeah, there's a very deceptive picture that's being presented here, essentially through omission. Holton himself in his academic work is actually much more measured. So he recently wrote a book that explores some of these same themes. Liberty is Sweet is the title of the book. But his older work as well, going back into the beginning of his academic career, has been exploring this theme that, yes, slavery is a complex issue that cuts across the entire revolutionary cause. There are pro-slavery and anti-slavery revolutionaries. There are pro-slavery and anti-slavery loyalists and figures on the British side. So he's told that story before with nuance. But when you get into the documentary series, the nuance seems to go out the window and you start making these bold claims about Dunmore's proclamation being essentially the major document. Holton uses it to describe Virginia. Hannah-Jones seems to fluctuate between language where she says some of the colonists and some points, and other points she says the colonists. So it's not with that caveat anymore. So she gives a very misleading picture of what's really playing out. And I think it's that exact lack of nuance that gets her into trouble with real historical scholarship. And this is something that several of us have been pointing out since the beginning of the 1619 Project.
Well, I did ask Woody Holton a couple of years ago to come on the podcast to discuss this. He declined because he told me he did not like the newspaper's ownership. For now, let's stay with the arguments Holton has made about this. I just mentioned how he distorts the quote from Rutledge in the docuseries. The great Sean Wilentz wrote a review of Liberty is Sweet that also deals with Holton's more recent claims about Dunmore in, for instance, an op-ed in the Washington Post. Wilentz writes, in the New York Review of Books, historians have known all about this for a very long time, and Holton's blitz of documents is mostly noisy obfuscation. What Liberty is Sweet fails to offer is a single piece of evidence, letter or diary entry or newspaper article or pamphlet, in which any patriot states that Dunmore's proclamation converted him or anyone else to support independence. Without that evidence, Holton's argument collapses. So he did do this document dump on Twitter, Woody Holton. I think he did 73 different documents. Have you seen that string of documents?
I have.
Yeah, what did you think
And
of it?
there's interesting material there. But again, it's exactly as you say. He doesn't have an airtight case for the inferences that he's making from these documents. They are showing certainly that people were upset by Dunmore's proclamation. I don't think any historian has ever denied that. They're also upset by other features of Dunmore's proclamation. A lot of the slave owners are responding to it not because he thinks the British are about to come in and emancipate all the slaves, but because he thinks that Dunmore is essentially trying a time-honored and true military tactic back to the ancient world, and that is to foment a slave revolt. To foment chaos in the colony as a military strategy. And most of the objections to Dunmore's proclamation basically amount to that. They're concerned that he's fomenting the exact type of slave revolt that he earlier had promised he was taking the gunpowder to essentially protect them from. They're mad at Dunmore because he's a duplicitous agent. They're mad at Dunmore because they see him as trying to bring violence and chaos to the colony as a way to regain his rule, not because they think there's an impending Emancipation Proclamation, which is also language that both Holton and Nicole Hannah-Jones use many times in describing Dunmore's proclamation. The idea here is to obviously draw a parallel to Abraham Lincoln. Even though they're two very different documents of different motives, the scope between the two is so vast that the analogy itself almost becomes offensive.
Yeah, the pro-slavery revolution took place in 1860, not 1775. So Holton wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, and Carol Birkin, Richard Brown, Jane Calvert, Joseph Ellis, Jack Rakove, and Gordon Wood wrote a response to it. They're all fine historians, who said in 1774, the colonists had already become effectively independent of British authority, as former American Historical Association President Mary Beth Norton exhaustively demonstrates in her recent book on that fateful year. It was Parliament's extraordinary series of coercive acts punishing the colony of Massachusetts for the December 1773 Boston Tea Party that clinched the case for eventual independence. That repressive legislation, which the colonists regarded as intolerable, closed the port of Boston and took several dramatic steps to expand royal power in the colony. Basically, what they're saying is chronology here. They have the chronology wrong and they can't overcome that. But, to my earlier point about, we get involved in this point-by-point refutation or arguing about, what the Dunmore Proclamation said or didn't say or what people thought of it at the time, we lose sight of the big picture here. In a causal hierarchy, how do you like that for an academic term? If you were to make a causal hierarchy of what caused the break with the crown, this is way down the list, way down the list if it shows up on the list at all.
Absolutely. It's a minor issue in the grander scheme of things, especially in Virginia. I mean, as you note, the timeline is the main thing that always works against this Dunmore argument. It's 1774 is the real breaking point. And you see this in Virginia, not only the House of Burgesses, the resolution that they adopted, the prayer and fasting resolution that causes Dunmore to basically dissolve the body. A few weeks after that, there's a document that comes out of Northern Virginia. It's called the Fairfax Resolves. It's listed signatories are all of the major figures of Virginia politics in that era. Two of the main signatories are George Washington and George Mason, to give you an example. And this is a proclamation that they issue basically rejecting parliamentary authority to exercise its control over the colonies, in particular, these punitive acts that are taken against Boston. It's a political document in the sense that it's articulating a theory of government that rejects the very notion of Parliament governing the colonies from abroad. It shows up in a timeline that doesn't work for Dunmore's proclamation. And this is why you get back to the Hulu series, which starts to take liberties with the timeline itself. One of the major things that happens in the Hulu series, they're filming on the ground in Williamsburg, Virginia. They're sitting in front of the governor's palace. As Holton and Hannah-Jones are relaying these events about the November 1775 Dunmore Proclamation, again, happens after the revolution's already underway, Holton stands up and he points at the door of the governor's palace and basically says, from that building comes this proclamation, and that building represents the crown authority. He makes it sound as if like Dunmore walked to the door of the building and pulled out a piece of paper and had it read to the colonists that I am freeing your slaves. But none of this happened at all. Dunmore had been living in exile aboard a ship for over 5 months. He has lost the colony. He has been driven off the coast. He's abandoned almost all of the remaining loyalist strongholds around Norfolk by that point in the Revolution. The whole purpose of the document is to build a militia so he can have a landing party and try to come in and retake the colony of Virginia.
So the Declaration of Independence, the 27th grievance listed against King George, written by Thomas Jefferson and his fellow rebels who helped edit, fortunately for Jefferson, helped edit the Declaration. The 27th does mention Dunmore's, without naming him, it references, I should say, Dunmore's offer of freedom and weapons to those African-American slaves in Virginia who joined the British forces. But as historian Andrew Roberts also points out in his excellent biography of King George III, he refers to this grievance, actually number 23 all the way through 27, concern the war itself, the fighting at Bunker Hill, occupation of Boston, burning of Falmouth and Norfolk, and so on, an ex post facto ploy to use British attempts to suppress the rebellion as a justification for the rebellion itself. So You can't even point to the Declaration of Independence, as much as we revere that document as evidence to back up this claim. So why then? Why then can't they drop this Dunmore stuff? And I don't know, but here's my guess. I mean, number one, it's, I guess, hard to admit error when your piece has won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary and you have the Hulu documentary now. But I think also the point of the 1619 Project is to frame all of American history as an act of white supremacy, an unbroken line of white supremacy, where Black Americans had to pretty much fight on their own against oppression to become full citizens. So the American Revolution then has to fit with that narrative, that in some places it was actually a pro-slavery revolution. I don't know if I'm overstating things. I don't know what you think of that, but I'll leave you with one more Holton quote here before we move on to a different topic. He says in the docuseries, both economically and politically, enslaved people were at the center of the story. I would say I think if slaves had been as passive as I was taught they were in Virginia schools in the 1960s, then the revolution might not have ever come to the South, and you can't win the revolution without the South. That is Woody Holton. So there he is tying behavior of slaves and then Dunmore in 1775 to the success of the entire revolution. I gotta say, that is one of the most preposterous things I've ever heard a serious historian say. It's not the more measured claim that colonists were angry at this. It's more maximalist.
Yeah, it's hyperbole for the docuseries, and it's hyperbole for his public pronouncements that he's made. There are two Woody Holtons here. There's one, Woody Holton, the scholar, that adds nuance in his academic text, and then there's another Woody Holton that appears in these videos and makes sweeping proclamations and claims about slavery that he probably cannot support in evidence.
And he also attacked Gordon Wood at a debate with Wood about all of this, saying that scholars on the left who have criticized the 1619 Project are giving cover to people on the right who want to ban it, and CRT. I think that's an unfair charge. All right, I think we've tackled Dunmore, and I doubt Woody Holton listens to my podcast, but if he wants to come on at some point, he is welcome to discuss this. So why don't you think this was an Emancipation Proclamation? I think it's wrong to compare it to Lincoln's, or at least on the scale of Lincoln's, capital E, capital P. But it did affect military emancipation. And Americans, after the Revolutionary War, Treaty of Paris, after the War of 1812 and the Treaty of Ghent, there was broad consensus, as Jim Oakes argues in his book, The Scorpion Sting, that military emancipation is legal and you could not get your slaves back who were with the British when the war ended in whenever it was, 81, 83.
So I fully agree that, yes, there are means of military emancipation that do take place in the American Revolution. It's actually widely used as a tool and a tactic. One of the oddities of the 1619 Project, though, is that they selected Lord Dunmore to be like their standard bearer for this particular cause. Dunmore is supposedly the mechanism that leads the British into this route. A much better case, and I've pointed this out basically since 2019, when the first series was released, a much better case of the British using military means to effect emancipation occurs in the evacuation of New York City several years later. The British commander, Sir Guy Carleton, what he does is, as he's exiting the city, pulling all of the British troops out, he evacuates with an estimated somewhere in the neighborhood of probably about 3,000 enslaved people or formerly enslaved people that had made their way to the British lines, and he relocates them to Nova Scotia, resettles them in the British Empire. And that itself does become a true act of emancipation. He's actually pretty firm on this, and the colonial administrators that exit with him draw the line there and said, no, we are not sending these people back to slavery. And you have a decade worth of protests coming out of the American government after the Revolution, first asking for the slaves to be returned, and then they also ask for payment. And this becomes a diplomatic row with the British Empire. Yeah. Yes, that's a very real story. It tells how slavery cross-cuts the revolution. I juxtapose it to some bad actors on the British side, especially we see in the southern phase of the Revolutionary War. Everyone knows the infamous cavalry commander, Banastre Tarleton. He turns out to be just a really villainous figure in terms of American history. Not only his conduct in the war, he is also the son of one of the largest slave traders in the port of Liverpool in England. And after the war, he goes back into Parliament and becomes the main guy arguing in Parliament to preserve and extend the British slave trade. You know, there's some evidence he was probably on an adventure in the colonies looking for a way to get his own stake in the slave empire. this story is playing out with pro-slavery and anti-slavery actions of varying degrees across both sides of the war. Some of them, the British do have the upper hand on the moral and political basis, but in other cases, they're in the wrong.
And the anti-slavery movement prior to the American Revolution was tiny. I don't even know if we can call it a movement. Really, the impulses of the American Revolution led to the first true abolitionist movement in history. So, to your point earlier, June 3rd, 1780, British Commander Henry Clinton issued a proclamation more expansive than Dunmore's, promising freedom to all rebel-owned slaves who came within his lines, whether or not they offered their military service to His Majesty's forces or not. And I'm reading here from James Oakes's The Scorpion Sting. He has a chapter that goes through all these arguments as they developed over time, the laws of war, the treaties that were signed, where it became accepted that slaves lost in war were freed, and their owners were not, eventually the colonists come around to this position, not entitled to compensation for them. Alexander Hamilton wrote eloquently about this. Right. Capitalism and slavery. It is my position that it was capitalism that drove the development of slavery, not the other way around. What do you have to say about that after you've watched this second episode of the Hulu series?
My main comment on that is that the Hulu series and Nicole Hannah-Jones' presentation on this issue is deeply confused, including in circular and self-contradictory ways. They can't even work out the causality. Does capitalism cause slavery? Does slavery cause capitalism? And in fact, they use these two arguments almost interchangeably. But what it boils down to at the end of the day is she's relying on a very unreliable strain of academic literature on the economics of slavery. Now, I come at this as an economic historian. Slavery is probably the single most thoroughly investigated and written about subject in the entire field of economic history. This is something that has produced hundreds of books and probably thousands of academic articles, studies, empirical analyses. It's a deep and vast literature that goes back to at least the 1950s, if not earlier in some of the earlier work that was done on this. But it's a debate and discussion area that's been raging for the better part of the last century. What Nicole Hannah-Jones does is she taps into a very narrow echo chamber of a recent school of historiography that burst onto the scene in the 2010s. They refer to themselves as the new historians of capitalism. It's something of a self-designated name, but I make the argument that it's a misnomer because the new historians of capitalism aren't really arguing anything new. They're almost unintentionally resuscitating an old economic narrative from the 19th century, and that narrative is that the cotton industry in the United States, is the font of the Industrial Revolution, is the mechanism by which the American economy developed and grew and became wealthy. If you are starting to see where I'm going on this, that was the argument put forth by the King Cotton theorists of the 1850s, mostly Southern plantation owners who were making the argument that if anyone strikes against slavery, if anyone tries to emancipate their slaves or even restrict slavery's spread into the territories or spread abroad, they would be undermining the economic engine of the United States. And with this in mind, the Confederacy declares its independence, the Southern states secede, and they adopt an economic and diplomatic strategy around the premise that cotton is indeed the king of the world economy. We know how that works because the Civil War turns very differently on economic terms than what the King Cotton theorists had predicted. In fact, the South is overwhelmed by the Northern industrial superiority. And oh, by the way, all of these industries that are supposedly dependent on the plantations of the South for cotton, they turn elsewhere. They look to Egypt. They look to the Caribbean. They look to South America. They look to India for alternative crops and do so with a fairly seamless transition.
Well, as James Oakes wrote in an essay for the journal Catalyst about the 1619 Project, the 1619 Project's larger purpose is to tie the fortunes of Southern slavery to the fortunes of the larger capitalist world economy in which it was embedded. No one doubts, he says, the slave economy of the South was linked to the rapidly developing economies of the North and of Britain. But anecdotes about this bank or that insurance company doing business in the South do not qualify as evidence that Northern economic development was fueled by Southern slavery, nor do they demonstrate that Northern finance fueled the growth of slavery. I think they get the relationship backwards, really. The Northern economy would not collapse without slavery. I mean, that's kind of the argument they made, that the entire country's wealth was tied up in slavery rather than the wealth of slaveholders was tied up in slavery.
Exactly.
Yeah, not to say that, cotton obviously was a very important
Sure.
export commodity in the 19th century.
The issue here, it is a matter of empirics. The question they are asking is an absolutely clear empirical question. What's the relationship between the cotton sector and the American economy as a whole? Well, we find out cotton probably accounts in the antebellum era to roughly about 6% of GDP. That's a very large sector taken in itself. It's roughly on par with certain times in the 19th century what the railroad sector looks for. But these monocausal explanations of American economic development, they really miss the mark. Because if you're going to make this claim about one sector, you also have to do similar calculations about every other major economic sector and figure out their component of the national economy. And they don't do that. Cotton, again, they also use this misleading claim about cotton being the major export of the United States, which it absolutely is. But the export volume that comes from cotton in the antebellum era only amounts to about 7% of national output.
Wow.
So it's a very small sector of the economy that looks very big if you take it in a subset, the export market. So they're really kind of playing a statistical sleight of hand here to elevate cotton from certainly an important industry and a large industry, but one among hundreds, if not thousands, of other means of production that are contributing to the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And they try to make it the sole story, which is just empirical nonsense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the idea that we have capitalism because of slavery doesn't make any sense. You don't have to be an expert to know that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, why isn't Brazil, which has one of the largest slave economies of the 18th and 19th centuries, why isn't Brazil the starting point of the Industrial Revolution? And they never really have a good answer for that question.
Yeah. Well, slavery was profitable. Obviously, it was very profitable for planters, right? But it left the South an economic backwater. It caused the immiseration of the Southern population, white and black. It was a lousy way to run an economy, despite all the wealth it created for some people.
It makes a very small elite cohort of planters extremely wealthy, and extremely wealthy in the present.
And politically powerful because of that wealth.
And they become politically entrenched. It's the people that are in the legislatures. And once they attain a foothold in Congress, once they attain a foothold in their state governments, what do the slave owners do? They start voting themselves public resources. They start saying, we're going to take tax dollars from the national treasury and use it on hiring fugitive slave patrols to keep our institution in place, to bear some of the costs of our institution. So it's really insidious in that respect, but it does not lead to economic development. And we have clear, unambiguous empirical evidence on the county by county level. Counties where slavery was a prominent part of the economy before the Civil War lag economically in their development for decades, for generations after the Civil War. Counties where slavery was not prominent, or counties that are in the free parts of the country, excel economically. There's a clear causality that can be established here by comparing the different regions of the country. And in fact, the abolitionists saw and knew that. They knew that this institution, even though it's enriching a very small number of elite, it is also essentially retarding industrialization of the entire Southern economy, which we see in real time in the Civil War. Southern industry cannot even meet the minimums of the war cause. And that's why they're just completely walloped by the Union Army in armaments, in production, and eventually on the battlefield.
So although I have problems with the 1619 Project and what we've been discussing here, I don't think legislatures and politicians should be banning it. I have a problem with banning ideas and words from classrooms. Doesn't mean I think it should be taught necessarily, but this whole debate that's going on now, and I don't know if you want to call it a culture war, a history war, I'd like to get your take on this, where you stand. I have nephews who go to school. They're 13 and 8 years old. I hope I'm right about their ages. Fellas, if you're listening, your uncle apologizes if I've gotten your ages wrong again. They're 13 and 8. They go to school in public school in Loudoun County, which was one of the epicenters of the recent panic over critical race theory. They are not being taught critical race theory. I'm not even sure 1619 Project is critical race theory. What am I missing here?
I think what we're seeing are some loud and noisy bad actors on both sides of the equation. One of the things you have to remember is when the New York Times rolled out the 1619 Project, they had a very well-funded, well-financed, neatly packaged K through 12 education curriculum to accompany it. They launched it on the exact same day. There's money behind it. They're running Super Bowl ads touting this thing. They also have with the Hulu series a curriculum to try to bring it into the classroom. Then you have critics of the 1619 Project, mostly on the political right now, so it's different from the academic critics. They see this, and their response is a reaction to that educational push, and they use a very blunt instrument. They start saying, well, no, we're going to ban this entirely from being taught, which I think is completely the wrong way to go about dealing with the controversies in the 1619 Project. You know, in my ideal world, if I were to remove myself from the politics of it, I would say design a classroom curriculum that encourages students to read not only the 1619 Project, but a representative sample of the critics. Put them side by side. They're all short essays. They're all generally accessible. You can put them point and counterpoint and make an entire lesson around that. I don't have any confidence that either side of this public political debate is willing to do that. And as a result, students are basically caught in this political debate in ways that sell them short.
How do you define critical race theory?
Well, that's the funny thing. I always hear this term, and I like to turn it around and present it to exponents of critical race theory, because if you ask even some of the leading academics that consider themselves critical race theorists, you get kind of a word salad style answer of ambiguous aphorisms. They'll state platitudes about the role of race in history, and that critical race theory is supposedly this approach that tries to bring it to the surface. My own definition of critical race theory I draw from the original academic text. It's an application of a style of analysis called critical theory to the terms of race. What is critical theory? Well, it was a concept first put forth in the 1930s by a theorist, philosopher by the name of Max Horkheimer in Germany. And he basically categorized the world into two different ways of interpreting events around them. One is traditional theory. And traditional theory is basic scholarship of the time that he's critiquing. And then critical theory is theory that's infused with an emancipatory mission. Traditional theory, he says, holds up existing power structures. Critical theory tries to tear them down, is the very short version of them. And what happens if we fast forward in time, about 60 years later, the critical theory movement is established as a mode of analysis for social scientific events.
It's an academic methodology developed in law school about institutional racism, not individual attitudes. And the notion now that children across the country are being indoctrinated into this, I don't see that. Do you?
Well, you aren't getting the law school version of it by any means. I think you see derivatives of it in adjacent content with it. Like if you were to ask Nikole Hannah-Jones, do you support critical race theory? She would probably say absolutely yes, and it's needed in the schools. So there's the other thing about it. A lot of the people that are objecting to the anti-CRT push on the right, their complaint is not so much that CRT is being taught in the schools. They want more CRT taught in the schools, but they don't currently have that.
I don't know how, sorry to interrupt, I don't know how it would manifest itself in, say, my nephew, who's 13 years old in his basic social studies classes, maybe for older students. So they'll take us to the Florida issue here with Governor DeSantis objecting to the advanced placement course for high school seniors, so they would get college credit for this, African-American history. And I got to tell you, I looked at what was in the original prior to the revisions, and it's not clear that those revisions were the result of DeSantis's objections.
Right.
Although that's how it was framed in many newspapers. But I saw the original one, and yeah, there's some far left stuff on there. Andrew Sullivan made a good point that there should have been more balance, and I guess they've removed some of the more far to the left proponents of reparations or whatever. Here's my point about this. I went to a very liberal college in the mid-1990s, Ithaca College. And I was glad I was exposed, maybe not at the time because it chafed what I thought was the truth about my country, right? I was glad I got exposed to, I don't want to call them radical, but ideas with which I was not familiar or comfortable. So I just don't understand why there was such a backlash to that curriculum. It's not indoctrination, learning about new ideas. When you read Mein Kampf, you're not indoctrinating yourself into,
no one reads Mein Kampf because they want to support Hitler.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe it's not the right time, but introducing high school seniors to black queer theory or whatever was in that thing isn't indoctrinating them. It's just letting them know that this is out there. Oh, what's your take on that?
Well, I think there's a problem of nuance in the way that CRT has been depicted, but there's also a problem of nuance in what's being smuggled in with some of these ideas. And this is really what gets to the core of something like the College Board's revision. Revisions to these courses take place regardless of the subject matter, which is why I'm more skeptical of the notion that this is purely a political response to DeSantis. It's probably something that was already underway.
Yeah, I agree with that.
What you see in the CRT literature, just as any other academic literature, there is a wide variety of quality and rigor. You have some very rigorous texts that have historical significance. I would argue, say, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is very much a figure of the political left, is also a significant figure in the history and theory of race relations. And I think almost any educated person should read Du Bois and should do so with a critical eye, but one that also understands the arguments he is making. There's a very different level of rigor between Du Bois and a popular op-ed written by Ibram X. Kendi that's now being touted as supposedly the face of critical race theory, which I think is a much lower level of rigor that goes into that type of an op-ed. So when you see both of those blurred together on the same curriculum, it becomes an excuse for the critics to toss out the entire curriculum. But it also becomes an excuse or a mechanism for the proponents of CRT to use Du Bois to smuggle in weaker arguments that have a much more ideological flavor into what they are presenting as this analysis of race, this analysis of racial discrimination. And that's where they get into the trouble of squeezing out alternative viewpoints. That's why you don't have, or at least the original version of the curriculum, and I think this was the Andrew Sullivan point, yes, if they're going to present ideological tracts from the left in favor of critical race theory, why not talk about Thomas Sowell's work, a conservative viewpoint on racial discrimination
and reparations?
Why not juxtapose Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois as historical interlocutors of each other?
One thing I'm certain of is that politicians don't know what they're talking about in these debates. Maybe that's too strong. I would like to just leave these to educators, but we know that's impossible. I mean, when there was a big curriculum uproar in the 1990s, it became very, very political. I think it was Dick Cheney's wife, a terrific historian in her own right, I might be getting this wrong, who made a comment that Harriet Tubman was mentioned more in this curriculum revision than Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant. My point is, even 30 years ago when this came up, there were people complaining that too much slavery, not enough slavery, too much race, not enough race. It always becomes political.
It's not as if the textbooks were doing a good job of teaching American history before the 1619 Project. In fact, I've long been a critic of this. I've pointed out textbooks generally give, at most, a superficial analysis of slavery, and at worst, it gets into this thing like name counting, as you say, on how many times Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee are mentioned, which is just not a very constructive approach to teaching in the classrooms. We should actually jettison the textbook-style version of teaching American history, present students with primary source documents as these debates are playing out historically. Let them read Dunmore's proclamation, but also let them read some of the arguments of James Otis coming out of Massachusetts. Not only no taxation without representation, but Otis's own condemnation of the slave trade. Put those side by side and let students discern how the debates played out in real time.
Yeah.
That's a much better approach than the textbooks.
Well, you're raising a very difficult issue here, and that is, and I've discussed this with David Silverman, a historian of Native American history. The 1619 Project pretty much ignores all of that, but they were focusing on slavery. But that issue is, how old should children be when they start to learn about colonialism? Colonialism is has always been a very nasty, bloody business. Relations between the English or the European colonists and the Indians were violent. We learn about the first Thanksgiving, which is like a fantasy, candy-coated view of what was going on in Plymouth Colony, right? But, if you start teaching kids about King Philip's War and torture and burning people alive and chopping their heads off, parents would go nuts.
Yeah, you give the kids nightmares. It is tricky.
Yes.
Children do get to a certain age where this may be appropriate for high school and college curricula. And that's absolutely a point where the complexities and horrors of our past need to be taught. That includes the downsides that come with any mass migration, often colonialism, oppression, disease, warfare. All of these things follow. This is not just a part of American history, it's a part of human history, and we should confront it in honest ways. at the same time using it as a political weapon to try and enlist kindergarteners, like a protest march, which I think sometimes you get the vibe that that's what some of these activist types are going for. That seems to be a really inappropriate way of tackling complex subjects of history, because again, it's not about the history instruction that they're going for. It's about the political activism and uses of that history.
Well, I've seen these anecdotes, and there are so many thousands of school districts and schools in our country. It's hard to know how widespread all this is. Well, last question. Do you think this will be the last podcast I ever do about Dunmore?
Well, I thought that some of the debates about the 1619 project that played out in 2019 were going to at least settle it before a new iteration of our historical analysis of these questions were undertaken. A quick public debate that maybe played out over a couple of weeks or maybe a couple months. Here we are 3.5, almost 4 years later, and we're still litigating over Lord Dunmore.
Well, I hope we are done with Dunmore. And if you'd like to follow Phil Magness's posts about the 1619 project and other historical and economic matters, he is on Twitter. You can follow him at Phil W. Magness, and that is spelled Magness. And here is a news item that broke after we were done recording our conversation. While the College Board was developing its first advanced placement course in African American Studies, it was in repeated contact with the DeSantis administration in Florida. But the board said Florida's concerns did not influence any revisions to the course, which had been shaped instead by feedback from educators. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Russian invasion of Ukraine 1 year later. We have a 2-part series coming up with Michael Kimmage and Anatole Levin. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.